Welcome to Defenders, the teaching class of Dr. William Lane Craig. Today, The Existence of God, Part 4. For more information and resources, go to reasonablefaith.org.
We've been talking about the cosmological argument for God's existence. And we've seen that the first premise of that argument, that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or else in an external cause, is an intuitively plausible premise, and that the atheist attempt to make the universe an exception to the rule is arbitrary and unjustified. Moreover, we saw that the second premise, that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God, is logically equivalent to the typical atheist response to the argument, namely that if atheism is true, then the universe has no explanation of its existence. And we saw, moreover, that that second premise is very plausible in its own right. Given, then, that the universe exists, it follows logically from those premises that God exists. Now, the reason for the reluctance of atheists to say that the universe exists necessarily, I think, isn't hard to see. When we look out at the universe, none of the things that the universe is composed of seems to exist necessarily. Planets, stars, comets, dust, radiation, galaxies, none of these things seem to exist necessarily. They could all fail to exist. In fact, at some point in the past, none of them did exist when the universe was in a very dense state, and those things had not yet formed. So that none of these things that make up the universe seem to exist necessarily. So why think that the universe exists necessarily? Now, the atheist, I think, might say at this point, well, all right, none of those things exist necessarily, but the matter of which those things are composed exists necessarily. Matter exists necessarily, and these different things are just different configurations of matter, just different shapes and formations of matter. None of them exist necessarily, but the matter itself is a necessarily existent thing. Well, let's think about that suggestion a little bit. I think one of the problems with this suggestion is that according to the standard model of subatomic physics, matter itself is composed of tiny particles, like quarks, for example. And the universe is just the collection of all of these particles arranged in different ways. Now think about those quarks of which things are composed. Couldn't the universe have been composed of a different collection of quarks than the collection that exists today? Does each and every quark in the universe exist necessarily? Is every quark in the universe a necessary being that has to exist? I think it would be crazy to say that each and every quark in the universe exists necessarily by a necessity of its own nature, and that therefore this is the only collection of quarks that could possibly have existed. Now, notice what the atheist cannot say at this point. He cannot say, well, those quarks are all just different configurations of matter, and you could have a different set of quarks, but it would be the same matter. He can't say that because quarks aren't made of anything else. Quarks just are the basic units of matter. So if the quarks don't exist, the matter doesn't exist. It's not as though the quarks are composed out of something else. They just are the basic units of matter. So if there aren't these quarks, the matter doesn't exist. But it seems obvious that a different collection of quarks could have existed than the collection of quarks, the swarm that forms our universe today. And if that's the case, then I think a different universe would have existed. Now, to see this point, I want you to think about your shoes that you're wearing right now and ask yourself the question, could those shoes have been made of steel? Now, I'm not saying could you have had a different pair of shoes made out of steel that were in the same shape and size as the shoes you're wearing. I'm asking, could the very shoes that you have on, those very shoes, could they have been made of steel? Well, I think the answer is obviously not. That would be a different pair of shoes that just was in the same shape and size as the shoes that you have on, but it wouldn't be that very pair of shoes. And the same is true of the universe. A universe which is made of a different collection of quarks wouldn't be the same universe. It would be a different universe. Now, somebody might say at this point, well, wait a minute though, Bill. Think of the matter that composes my body. Every 7 years or so, I'm told, all of the matter, or virtually all of the matter in my body is recycled. So that the body that I have now is made out of completely different matter than the body I had, say, when I was 14 years old or younger. And yet, it's the same body. I still have an identical body, even though it's made out of new stuff. So, in the same way, couldn't the universe be identical across possible worlds, even though in one possible world it's composed of one collection of quarks, and in some other possible world it's composed of a different collection of quarks? Couldn't it still be the same universe, just as my body is the same body, even though it's composed out of different stuff than it used to be? Well, I think there's a crucial disanalogy between these two cases. In the case of the universe, the difference across possible worlds is not a matter of intrinsic change. It's not as though the universe changes from one to the other by replacing quarks until you get to the other one. Whereas in my body, you have material historical continuity of my 14-year-old body to my present body. And therefore, my body can be identical over this intrinsic change as the matter is replaced. But you see, the difference between these universes in different possible worlds isn't a matter of change at all. There is nothing that endures from one possible world to another. This is more like talking about the matter that composes my body and the matter composing Joe Mulvihill's body. And those are two different bodies. Or, again, the example of the shoes made out of steel being a different pair of shoes than the leather, the canvas shoes that you have now. So I think that this gives us good reason to think that the universe, if it could have been composed of a different collection of quarks, wouldn't be the same universe. And therefore, this universe does not exist necessarily. Now, the point that I'm making here becomes all the more obvious when you reflect on the fact that it's possible that there could be a universe governed by completely different laws of nature, that doesn't even have quarks in it, that has different sorts of particles or substances, maybe strings or something as the basic units of material objects, and governed by different laws of nature. And to think that in that case that would be the same universe as this one would be like thinking that this pane of glass would be the same pane of glass if it were made out of steel instead of made out of the glass that it's made out of. That would just be a different substance. It would be a different thing with different properties. And so it seems to me very plausible to think that the universe doesn't exist necessarily, that you could have had a different collection of quarks and therefore a different universe, or a universe that's composed of totally different sorts of substances with different laws of nature and different properties. Now, I don't think any atheist is going to be so bold as to assert that some quarks exist necessarily, but others don't. That there are certain quarks in the universe, a kind of subset, a select number, that have this occult property of existing necessarily, while the other quarks exist contingently. I think that's completely implausible. It's all or nothing here. Either they're all necessary in their being, they all exist by a necessity of their own nature, or none of them does. And I don't think anyone would say that every single quark in the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature. And therefore it would follow that a universe which is composed of such quarks doesn't exist by a necessity of its own nature either. And notice that this is the case whether you think of the universe as an object in its own right. It would be like a statue made out of marble being different from another statue that's made out of a different block of marble. They would not be the same statue. They would be different. Similarly, if you think of the universe as an object in its own right, it would be a different object than one made out of different stuff. Or if you think of the universe not as an object, but just as a collection of objects, a group of the things in the universe, this would be analogous to a flock of birds not being the same as a different flock of birds if it is composed of different birds. A flock isn't an object in its own right. It's a collection of objects. But if the collection is made up of different members, if one is, say, a flock of pelicans and the other a flock of crows, it's not the same flock. Or even if you think of the universe as just being nothing over and above the objects that are in it. Still, if it's composed of different stuff, then you've got a different universe. And in all of these cases, then I think it would give us good reason for thinking that the universe doesn't exist by a necessity of its own nature, but exists contingently. All right, any questions on that? And let's wait. Okay, we got the microphone here. Go ahead.
Hey, Dr. Craig. So I know this is fairly hypothetical and sort of a long shot, but I know some modern string theorists like Brian Greene have posited that, of course, string theory says that quarks aren't the smallest thing, that strings are actually even smaller, and they are what compose everything. And although string theory is certainly not fully developed, and there's a lot of opposition to it, there's no doubt that some of the equations are starting to line up more and more and more as we get better at approximating them, and M-theory is starting to develop as well. And many have proposed that perhaps even brain theory and these equations will one day necessitate that the universe is in a sort of endless cycle with itself, where universe actually does exist the way it is necessarily because of the laws that govern it.
All right, let's clarify a couple of issues. First of all, if strings turn out to be the fundamental building blocks of nature, then I'll just substitute that in for what I said as quarks. In other words, the identity of these things doesn't make any difference. You can run the same argument whether the fundamental building blocks are strings or they're quarks. It doesn't make any difference. And with regard to these cosmological models that you're talking about, what those models attempt to show, Jonathan, is a universe which is eternal in the past and is constantly recycling and going on into the future. But that doesn't show that it exists necessarily, nor is there any claim that it exists necessarily. Leibniz's argument is not that there has to be an eternal thing.
Right. Well,
it's that it has to be a logically necessary thing, and there isn't any logical necessity that these sort of string models have to exist. It's logically possible that they're all wrong and that quarks are the fundamental building blocks of matter. So don't equate the eternality of the universe with its necessity. That's an error. Leibniz is quite willing to admit that the universe never had a beginning. This is not an argument for a beginning of the universe. You'll notice in the premises, that's nowhere stated. So if the universe has always existed, Leibniz would say, gosh, why does an eternal universe exist instead of just nothing? Or why does this eternal universe exist? And that question can still be asked. Go ahead.
I wasn't speaking necessarily from the eternity, but from the equations and the basic fundamental laws actually being necessary, because it's sort of like, imagine each equation is a different puzzle piece in this massive puzzle, and they all fit together so perfectly, and they couldn't have been any other way, and there couldn't have been a universe any other way, and that's what some of these theorists are positing. Certainly it's a long shot. The equations are far from developed, but I'm saying, say some plausible situation 20 years down the road when the equations, someone's come up with a way to work them all out, and they do fit together perfectly, and they do necessitate one another, because the five theories actually do necessitate each other from our current understanding. Like, one theory can't exist on its own, much in the same way 2 plus 2 doesn't necessitate 3 plus 3. but these equations necessitate each other.
Right. I understand there are these 5 different versions of string theory that can all be reduced to this one theory called M theory, that is a simpler reduction of these disparate theories. But that doesn't in any way show that what the theory postulates is logically necessary. You could have a universe that operates according to totally different laws of nature. All that would show is a kind of internal coherence. But you see, that internal coherence could be replaced by a totally different picture that is also logically coherent. And so you can't say that because something is internally logically bound up with itself, that whole scenario can't be replaced by another scenario.
I guess there would have to be, I suppose what I'm saying is I can't really think of an alternate, like if they develop this full theory, wouldn't we need to come up with another actual possible set of laws? Because if this is the only set of laws there are, then doesn't that argument fall apart? Like you need to come up with a possible world where there actually are a different set of laws governing a different set.
Well, that would be a very complex task to do, to try to do such a thing. But I think that even those who developed these theories don't think that they show that the universe exists logically necessarily. What you're talking about is the internal coherence of the laws with each other. And Leibniz would be quite happy to grant that the internal coherence of the laws necessitate each other. But that doesn't mean that the whole scenario exists with logical necessity. You can't judge from the internal coherence of something that the whole picture is logically necessary. Okay, some other question on this point. Yes?
I just want to clarify. So if the universe is not necessarily existent by its own nature, it has an external cause.
Yes.
Did you just posture that the external cause is quarks and how they behave?
No, not at all. What I was saying was, is the universe something that exists by a necessity of its own nature? And I was suggesting that not very many atheists, if any, hold to that view, because when you look out at the universe, you see that the stuff that it's made up of doesn't exist necessarily. And then I was using the quarks as being the sort of ultimate constituents of which the universe is composed. Now, one could have used strings instead if you want an alternate theory. No, they are the stuff of which the universe is made. They're the constituents of the universe. The universe is just either the collection of all these quarks, swarming and shaping in different ways, or it is an object that is composed or constituted by these quarks, like a marble statue is made of the marble. And my argument is that if the marble doesn't exist necessarily, then the statue can't exist necessarily. Because if you had different marble, you'd have a different statue. In the same way, you could have different quarks, and so you'd have a different universe. And that means the universe doesn't exist necessarily. You see the analogy? Think of the statue composed of the marble. And if the marble could be contingent, could be different, then you'd have a different statue. In the same way, the universe composed of all these quarks would be a different universe if it were composed of different stuff. Or think of the analogy of your shoes made of leather versus a pair of shoes made of steel. They're not the same shoes. That's a different pair of shoes, just of the same shape and size. Cindy had a question. Oh, I see. John's got one first, and then we'll come to Cindy. Okay.
Yeah, Bill, I'm not sure I heard you correctly, but when you were talking about the atheist out in San Diego that you questioned, and he was indignant, and he said, surely he believes that the universe is inexplicable and contingent.
Yes.
Now, by contingent, does he mean dependent?
Not exactly, John. What he means there is that it doesn't exist necessarily, that it could have failed to exist. So its existence isn't necessary.
Okay, because I was equating that, and I was thinking, well, how can you be an atheist and still be thinking it's contingent?
Right. If you think of contingency in the sense of dependency, that would automatically imply some higher reality on which it depends. But what he wants to say is that it exists. It's not necessary that it exists, but it just exists inexplicably. There just is no explanation for why there is a universe. And that is the typical response to this argument. But to cover all of our bases, we're looking at this hypothetical response that, yes, the universe does have an explanation, namely it exists by a necessity of its own nature. Cindy?
I think you just answered it.
Okay.
You're saying there are only two choices. Either, one is that it's either by its own nature,
right,
or an external cause.
Right.
Isn't the atheist stating that it's rather neither?
That's correct.
I mean, so
he denies the truth of the first premise.
Right,
typically.
and I was going to say, because I think the argument falls apart if you can't agree on the first contingency.
Right.
So he would disagree with your argument for the existence of God.
Yeah, he would disagree typically with the first premise.
Which means he doesn't believe it has to be one of those two things.
That's right.
Therefore,
he would say the universe just exists inexplicably.
Right.
So he would deny that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence.
So can you use that as an argument for the existence of God in your position if the people can't agree on this? So where does that leave?
Well, let's think about what the purpose of an argument is. For any argument, Cindy, if you want to deny the conclusion, all you have to do is deny one of the premises. Right. I mean, you can't force anybody to adopt your conclusion. All they have to do is pick one of the premises and deny it, and they will escape the conclusion. What you do in a successful argument is to try to raise the intellectual price tag of denying one of the premises so that the person sort of compromises his intellectual integrity to a degree by denying a premise which in every other case you would think is extremely plausible, and you begin to see that the only reason he denies it is to avoid the conclusion at the end that he doesn't want to believe in God. And if you can do that, I think that you have been successful. You have shown him what it's going to cost him to be an atheist, and some people will be persuaded. Some people will say, gosh, I guess I do think that everything that exists has an explanation. That does seem plausible, and so I'm going to change my mind, and I'm going to agree, yes, God exists.
On the arguments that the atheists that I've dealt with, that seems to be the underlying, what the position they seem to take is, we don't know. One day, we will know. What we do know is there's no God, and therefore anything you try to say to me that is quote-unquote proof there's a God, they're going to say that is really fallacious because the sheer existence of God is an impossibility.
Okay. Well, then you see what they've done, Cindy, is they have assumed an enormous burden of proof. They have just shouldered the burden of proof for the claim that God does not exist. And now you need to let them start giving their arguments and say, okay, give me your proof then that God does not exist. And that's very, very difficult to do. That's a very heavy burden to bear. In the absence of some overwhelming argument for atheism, I think their denial of premise one is just born out of stubbornness and a refusal to accept the conclusion. Otherwise, I think the premise is more plausible than it's contradictory, and that's all you need for a good argument. Doesn't need to be certain, just more plausible than its negation or its opposite. Yes, Colbert?
Yes, I'm enjoying this light Sunday school fare. Explain how the intelligent design movement would interface with what we're talking about.
Well, the next argument that we're going to talk about when we finish, well, actually not the next one, the third one that we'll talk about will be an argument for a cosmic designer of the universe. This is not based on the design of the universe, but just the very existence of the universe calls out or cries out for some kind of a transcendent cause.
To me, it appears the atheist worships the great lucky rabbit's foot in the sky.
Well, in the sense that he thinks that the universe just is sort of there and there's no explanation for it, I can sympathize with your
when you bring in your incredible fine-tuning arguments, it just becomes absurd.
Well, this is a good point, that we're building a cumulative case here. It will not be any single argument that bears the full weight. It will be the the accumulative arguments. And you start general with an argument like this, and then you get more and more specific, and I think the case becomes more and more powerful. Amy.
Speaking of intellectual price tags, is there anybody out there crazy enough to deny premise 3 that the universe exists, to try to claim it's some illusion and we're all ones and zeros or something?
Well, I suppose in one sense, in Eastern philosophy, like Hinduism and Taoism, there is a belief that the universe around us is ultimately illusory. But at least there is the illusion of the universe existing. And therefore, I don't think you can get away from the fact that there is the existence of something, and this requires an explanation. And so I don't think even that will work. But for people that we're apt to encounter, I think, in the Western world, people will, I think, agree that the universe exists. Yes, George.
Bill, Romans 1 says God's invisible attributes, eternal power, and divine nature are clearly seen, being understood through what's made. And it says that people have become futile in their speculations in response to that. I'm not asking you to be harsh in your assessment, but do you think that the resistance you see to these arguments, like Leibniz or the Kalam or the design argument, are an example of that?
I think some of it is, George, with regard to certain people who are willing to believe almost anything rather than theism. I think that there is clearly a kind of stubbornness there and simply an unwillingness to come to God. I don't want to say that everyone who resists these arguments does so, but I've met certain atheists who are willing to say that the universe just popped into being uncaused out of nothing, and that that's better than believing in a transcendent cause, which to me is far too high an intellectual price tag to pay to retain one's intellectual credibility. One more question, and then I want to go on to the next point. Yes.
I know of a very bright atheist who is truly seeking whether or not God could exist. What is the very best book that I could give him to read?
Well, that would depend on the level of his education.
Highly educated, highly bright. I mean, genius level, like.
Well, then I would direct him to the Blackwell Companion for Natural Theology.
Okay.
That just came out in the spring of this year.
Okay.
The Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. All right. I want to go to my second point, because that's not the only reason for thinking the universe doesn't exist by a necessity of its own nature. I think a second reason for thinking that the universe does not exist necessarily is that we have strong astrophysical evidence that the universe began to exist. You see, an essential property of a necessary being is eternality. That is to say, it exists without beginning and without end. Anything that comes into being at a certain time doesn't exist necessarily because it could fail to exist. So something that is necessary in its existence has to be eternal. And in one of the most startling developments of modern science, we now have pretty good evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 13 billion years ago in a cataclysmic event called the Big Bang. And what makes the Big Bang so startling is that it represents the origin of all matter and energy, even physical space and time themselves, out of nothing. The physicist P.C.W. Davies writes, and I quote, "The coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previous incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing." End quote. Now, of course, alternative theories have been proposed over the years to try to avoid the absolute beginning of the universe predicted by the standard Big Bang theory. But none of these theories has commended itself to the scientific community as more plausible than the Big Bang theory. In fact, in the year 2003, the cosmologists Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to craft a theorem which shows that any universe which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. Vilenkin pulls no punches. This is his statement, and I quote, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." End quote. So the beginning of the universe shows that the universe doesn't exist by a necessity of its own nature. It is contingent. It came into being at some point in the finite past. But not only that, the beginning of the universe shows the universe to be contingent in a very special way, I think. Namely, it came into existence from nothing. This is, I think, significant because it not only undermines the claim that the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature, but it also puts the atheist into an even more difficult position. Against Leibniz, the atheist could say, well, the universe has existed from eternity past without any explanation. And you can give the atheist a run for his money there. The universe is not necessary, but it is eternal, it has always existed, and it just exists inexplicably. But this evidence requires us to say that the universe is contingent in the sense that a finite time ago, it just popped into existence for no reason whatsoever, no explanation at all. And it seems to me that that is so outlandish that theism looks like a welcome alternative compared to that. So this second argument, I think, gives us not only good reason to think that the universe doesn't exist by a necessity of its own nature, but that it is contingent in a very special way that points to its ground in a transcendent external cause. Any comment about that second point? Okay, let's take Joe first, because he had a question.
Three quick things. One,
Okay.
One, could you talk about what problems that you would have with just disregarding premise number one? You discussed that in the last question. Just what's the negative? I mean, what's wrong with me just saying I don't know? Isn't that more humble? Two, could you talk about when somebody offers a promissory materialism, why that's just kind of putting the question off? Could you comment on? I don't know if you hear that a lot. That we're going to get to it. We're just give us time. Science is going to answer all your questions. And the third thing was necessary. Could it be possible that nothing exists by necessity of its own?
Well, actually, the third question and the first question are the same.
Okay, yeah.
And there, I simply appeal to the intuitive obviousness of premise one when you think about it. And I like the illustration that Richard Taylor gives of finding the ball in the woods. It just obviously needs some sort of explanation for why there's this ball lying on the floor of the forest there. And merely increasing the size of the ball till it becomes the size of the universe doesn't do anything to remove the need for the explanation of the universe or to provide an explanation. So that the atheist needs to give me some reason for thinking that the universe is an exception. And when we looked at the reasons, we saw they were question-begging, and therefore it seems to me that the first premise is plausibly true, and more plausibly true than its opposite. Now, I'm not saying it's certain, but you don't have to have certainty for an argument to be a good one. I think it's more plausible than its opposite. As for the materialist promissory note, I don't think that that's relevant, because we're not saying here that matter hasn't always existed or that it always will exist. We haven't even said that everything in the universe isn't composed of matter. The question is, does matter itself exist necessarily? And that isn't a scientific question, you see. That's a metaphysical question. There isn't any further research you could do, and that would be, again, in response to Jonathan's point, there's no further research you could do that would show that matter exists necessarily. That's a metaphysical point. Okay, Ted again.
Dr. Craig, I write poems and things. Some I wrote some time ago. It says, with the Big Bang Theory, there's really just one catch. There may have been a bang, but who lit the match?
Right. I didn't know you were a poet, then.
Joe, I want to know.
All right, yeah, go ahead.
I want to know, do you write country music lyrics? Because I want to buy some if you do.
Yeah, he could sing them, too, couldn't you?
Where the gentleman begged the question of the match. If the universe is all that exists by definition, and the bang is the beginning of some period of time, what is the argument that the atheist or anybody else has for what is before?
Okay, let's be very careful here. Did you notice how you defined the universe? You said, if the universe is all there is. See, that already is smuggling in the atheism through the back door. That is atheism. So you're reasoning in a circle if you say that the universe is all there is, because you're assuming there is nothing then beyond the universe. So that's arguing in a circle to say that the universe is all there is. So the question is that true, that the universe is all there is? And does it exist necessarily? That's the whole question that we're exploring here. Yes, along the back wall.
I've heard R.C. Sproul say that if the universe, as science says, is a finite system, has a beginning and has an end, it could have been brought about by another finite system, which had a beginning and end, and that could keep going for a long time, but it could not go on forever. At some point, there must have been an infinite to spawn the finites that spawn each other.
Well, that does seem to be the implication of the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. There are theories of the universe which are called multiverse theories, in which our universe is just, so to speak, a bubble in a wider reality which is composed of many bubbles and many universes. And what the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem shows is not simply that each universe must have a beginning, but that this entire multiverse system cannot be eternal in the past, but must have a beginning. So you can't escape the beginning of the universe and its contingency through simply saying that our universe is part of some wider reality that is greater than it. The Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem requires that even that greater reality has a boundary at some point in the past, and therefore came into being, and therefore doesn't exist necessarily, but is contingent. All right, well, we're out of time, so what we'll do next time is wrap up this argument from Leibniz by looking at one more possible atheistic response, which would be to say that it is necessary that something or other exists, necessary that some contingent being exists, but that there isn't any specific thing that exists necessarily, and we'll look at how one might respond to that final attempt to stave off the force of Leibniz's argument. Okay, we'll see you next time.
The copyright for the content of this recording is held by Dr. William Lane Craig. For more, go to reasonablefaith.org.